Unsurprisingly, the first 5 episodes of House of the Dragon has been filled with Easter eggs and references to the source material. So we thought, as we are at the halfway mark, we would go over 20 or so things that you might have missed in these episodes, so let's get going. Oh, and yes, there will be spoilers. Now, while this may be House of the Dragon, with the Targaryens being the main focal point of the show, they are not the only major house to be seen on screen. For casual Game of Thrones viewers, House Hightower may be a completely new name for you. But although they are not quite of the same standing as the House of the Dragon, they have a long and formidable history in Game of Thrones lore and are one of the biggest and most powerful houses of all time. But they are still not quite top dog, and the Hightowers still have to do a bit of climbing to get where they really want to be, something which Otto and his daughter Alicent have shown throughout the season already. Alicent, in particular, has shown that she is not afraid to climb the social ladder, even if it means crossing her former BFF Rhaenyra. This is showcased in her costume design, with the dresses she wears often laden with ladder motifs, because you need a really big ladder if you're a high tower. Huh? Eh? Huh? All you thronies likely caught this one, but just in case, the Valyrian dagger that King Viserys wields with the message of ice and fire on it may look familiar to you, and with good reason. It is the very same dagger that was used in an attempt to assassinate Bran Stark, which we later learned was owned by Littlefinger, but most importantly, well, it should have been important anyway, is it's the very same dagger that Arya used to kill the Night King and save Westeros from an eternal winter. Its previous holders are somewhat unknown in Game of Thrones, but House of the Dragon gives us some more context about the dagger, revealing that it's essentially a Targaryen heirloom, passing down from generation to generation until it is eventually given to the prince that was promised in the Song of Ice and Fire. It's almost like Jon Snow was meant to have a greater fate than the one given to him in Season 8. Anyway, that's for another video. Ooh, also, the necklace Daemon gives to Rhaenyra is made of Valyrian steel, along with the sword that he carries, Night Sister, whose fate in Game of Thrones is unknown. On the subject of Queen Alicent and her social climbing again, after the death of Aemma Otto tells Alicent to comfort the grieving king, which she does by reading to him as he works on his scale model, because as everyone knows, the way to a man's heart is reading. But the whole theme of Alicent reading to a Targaryen king has more to it than you may have realized. In George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, which the show is based on, we learn that a young Alicent used to read to Viserys' grandfather, King Jaehaerys. This is while he was dying, and it was even suggested that Alicent was also his lover. But as the majority of Blood and Fire is narrated as a history book with various perspectives suggesting different truths, not much can be taken as concrete fact. Now, while we have seen a number of dragons already in the show, none quite compared to that of Balerion the Black Dread, who was the largest dragon ever seen in Westeros and was ridden by Aegon the Conqueror as he set about invading the Seven Kingdoms. The skull of Balerion can be seen in the dungeons of the Red Keep, just like in Game of Thrones, but what is noticeable is that the size of Balerion's skull is much larger in House of the Dragon, to be more in keeping with the context and to showcase Balerion's size in contrast to the other dragons. Another thing to get a makeover and to be larger than in Game of Thrones is the Iron Throne itself, which is still not as big or as menacing as it's portrayed in the books, but at least it is somewhat more imposing than the one in Game of Thrones. One of the most prominent Targaryens in the show is the Queen Who Never Was, Rhaenys Targaryen, who actually wasn't that close to ascending the Iron Throne in the book, but anyway. During the games in the opening episode, she is asked for the favor of a Baratheon rider, not so subtly indicating that they would have preferred her as the monarch as opposed to King Viserys. But that's not just preference as to why the Baratheons would want her as queen, but because she is part Baratheon, much more than Joffrey anyway. She's the daughter of Aemon Targaryen and Jocelyn Baratheon, and it's something that you would be given for not knowing as she has the silver hair of the Targaryens, as opposed to the black hair of the Baratheons. Except, in the book, that's not the case, with her having the black hair of the Baratheons instead. Which, seeing as it is the dominant trait in the family, and the reason Ned Stark and Jon Arryn learned that Joffrey was not the son of Robert Baratheon, makes a whole lot of sense. We already mentioned the references to A Song of Ice and Fire in the show, but House of the Dragon also makes a reference to a particular book in the series. In the opening episode, as the subject of succession is discussed during a small council meeting, and each party begins claiming who they believe should succeed King Viserys, he realizes that the council is circling the throne like hungry crows around a dead body. This is, of course, a reference to the fourth book in the series, A Feast for Crows. Again, in the references to A Song of Ice and Fire, as Viserys tells Rhaenyra about the dream Aegon had in regards to the song, and the prophecy that's been handed down from generation to generation within the Targaryen monarchy, he says, "Promise me," in regards to her not forgetting about the prophecy. This is the same phrase that Lyanna Stark utters to her brother Ned as she asks him to protect her son, Jon, aka the man who knows nothing. As you know, things got a little heated in episode 2 after Daemon stole the dragon egg destined for Prince Baelon and absconded to Dragonstone, refusing to give it back, which is very mature. This was the egg purposely picked out by Rhaenyra, and she was not pleased about it being stolen. That's because it's the egg of one of the most famous dragons in Westerosi history, Dreamfire. Dreamfire was ridden by Rhaenyra's great aunt, Rhaena, who was married to Andro Farman, but had a taste for goose instead of duck, if you know what I mean, and instead had a relationship with Andrew's sister, Alyssa. Alyssa wanted to go off exploring the globe, but she was not given the gold from her lover Rhaena. So instead, she decided to steal 3 of Dreamfire's eggs and take off just like Daemon did. Now, while this has not been 100% confirmed, those 3 eggs were more than likely the very eggs that were gifted to Daenerys and grew up to become the dragons Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, making Dreamfire their mother. Another famous story in Game of Thrones history referenced in House of the Dragon is that of Nymeria. It's that banging song that Rhaenyra puts on repeat in episode 3, and it's also the story that she recounts to Alicent in episode 1. Princess Nymeria fled her Valyrian pursuers with 10,000 ships across the Narrow Sea, arriving in Dorne and destroying her own fleet to show her people they were finished running. Then she married Lord Loras Martell to unite Dorne under one flag for the first time. It is no surprise that Nymeria is referenced in House of the Dragon, as we can draw a number of parallels between Nymeria and Rhaenyra, with them having similar ambitions, views on gender, and Dornish lovers. Nymeria is also referenced in Game of Thrones, with Arya Stark naming her direwolf after the warrior queen. Another reference to Game of Thrones lore, and in particular Fire and Blood, comes in episode 3, as the highborn ladies gossip about, at the time, the floundering war in the Stepstones between the Triarchy and the combined forces of Daemon and the Sea Snake, and how Lady Joanna Swan was being held ransom by the Crab Feeder. The ladies gossip at how Joanna's famously tight-fisted uncle is unwilling to pay the ransom, and there's a rumor that Lady Swan will be sold to a pleasure house. Except, it's more than just a rumor, and it is the place where Lady Swan becomes known as the Black Swan. As Martin writes, after her uncle refused to pay the ransom, she was sold to a pillow house, where she rose to become the celebrated courtesan known as the Black Swan and ruler of lice in all but name. Alas, her tale, however fascinating, has no bearing upon our present history. It also has no real bearing upon this video, but hey, it's a nice reference. Also, in episode 3 is the moment where Rhaenyra is visited by a white hart. The white hart was the intended target of the royal hunt, but it managed to elude the hunters, with another ordinary stag becoming the victim, as a drunken Viserys fails to kill it in one blow, showing his weakness and ineffectiveness as king. And also, how he basically messes up everything he touches and causes immense suffering. Bit harsh, but true. Instead, the White Hart visits Rhaenyra, and the two have a moment, suggesting that Rhaenyra is the one truly destined to rule. The White Hart, or White Stag, has a long legacy in English culture, with it being on the banner of Richard II, and in particular, in Arthurian tales, where the creature has a perennial ability to evade capture, and that the pursuit of the animal represents mankind's spiritual quest. It also signaled that the time was high for the Knights of the Kingdom to pursue a quest, which means it could be signaling to Rhaenyra that it's time for her to pursue her quest of ascending to the Iron Throne. this is just a quick one. While we see a number of kingdoms and famous locations in Game of Thrones, there are a few that we didn't see that we do see in House of the Dragon, such as Storm's End, the ancestral home of the Baratheons, and Driftmark, the home of the Sea Snake, as well as a further glimpse of Old Town, which we did see in Game of Thrones, the home of the Hightowers. One of the major characters of Fire and Blood yet to be seen is that of the salacious quote-unquote historian, Mushroom, who provides an alternate, often more crude version of events than other historians. Mushroom serves as a fool for King Viserys, as well as other members of the Targaryen family, but I won't mention names as that would be very spoilery, and his first-hand account makes him a somewhat, emphasis on somewhat, more reliable source than he may seem. As we mentioned, we have yet to see Mushroom, but there is a character that somewhat resembles him in the wedding band in episode 5, although it is unclear whether it is indeed Mushroom or someone else entirely, as it was reported Mushroom was cut from the show. Also on the subject of Mushroom, the relationship between Sir Criston and Rhaenyra is left ambiguous in the book, but in the show, a much more straightforward retelling of events. Another ambiguous moment in the books is the fate of Daemon's wife, Rhea, whose death remains a mystery, but yeah, the subtext is still there. There's something about TV this year that likes to use secret tunnels to help move the plot along, whether it be House of the Dragon or only murders in the building, or actually I think that's it, but still, both the Red Keep and the Arconia have a number of hidden passageways so the residents can get up to all sorts of nefarious deeds. In the case of House of the Dragon, it's so Daemon can take Rhaenyra on the weirdest date of all time, and on that date, he employs what I like to call the Daemon system. So D is demonstrate value to the king by taking back the stepstones, and then A, which is arrange an inappropriate tour of King's Landing after dark with your niece, and then we've got E for engage her physically, then leave suddenly before telling the king you defiled his daughter. Then you got M, which we're gonna use for murder your wife and plan to take over her lands, and then for O, you've got openly flirt with your main ally's daughter, and N, neglect emotionally all the women in your life to further your own ambitions. Ah yeah, the Daemon system. Anyway, it's always sunny parody aside, the tunnels also have an important role in Game of Thrones, as they were used to spring Tyrion out of jail and also get him into Tywin's chamber so he could murder him along with his former lover, Shay. You probably missed this, but there is some debate amongst Viserys maesters about the best way to treat Viserys' various backsores and sliced up fingers. Grand Maester Melos wants to stick to maggots and leeches to take care of the king, but a younger maester named Orwell is all about something called herbal poultices. Remember the name, as he will likely be important later. However, despite being a major player in the Dance of Dragons, Maester Orwell isn't technically supposed to be in King's Landing at this time. In Fire and Blood, we learn that Orwell's care for Viserys was much better, as Martin writes, Orwell's potions and tinctures were more effective than the leechings Melos had preferred. So this mention of herbal poultices is clearly a reference to this line and how the old-fashioned treatment of leeches may not, surprisingly, have helped. Seeing as this is set in the past, a number of locations in King's Landing, including the city itself, are still standing and are in full glory. The most notable is the Dragon Pit, the ruins of which make multiple appearances in Game of Thrones, such as the moment that Jon and company show Cersei and the other major houses the white that they captured. It's also the place where arguably the most controversial moment of Game of Thrones history transpires, and Bran is named king by the newly formed council. Speaking of controversial, the existence of the Dragon Pit is also controversial in the books. Its prime hilltop location was once occupied by the Sept of Remembrance, but when a religious order rose up against the crown, King Maegor I to use the fire of his dragon Balerion to burn the Sept to the ground. In its place rose the Dragon Pit, a project that took 2 kings' reigns, 10 years, and vast amounts of gold to complete. It is also theorized that this overly glorified dragon stable actually stunted their growth and led to their near extinction. One of the biggest plot developments comes in episode 5 as it shows us the origin of the Greens, one of the two factions, the other being the Blacks in the Dance of the Dragons. Before that moment, Alicent had been mostly wearing the Targaryen color red, or occasionally the more neutral color of blue. But in episode 5, as Lars Strong explains to his brother in a moment of not-so-subtle exposition, House Hightower changes the color of the lighthouse lamp at Old Town to green. That's a signal to their bannermen that they are being called to war. That's the color, of course, that Alicent is wearing as she shows up late. And this is, of course, showing that her period of neutrality is over as we ramp up towards the infamous dance. Targaryens don't like just marrying their family members, but naming their offspring after them as well. And although he didn't last very long, the heir for a day was named after his grandfather, Balon. As the Maester informs Viserys that the infant's a boy and asks if he and the Queen had chosen a name, he whispers the name Balon. Now, while this series doesn't mention Aegon and Balon by name, at least not in context, Balon the Brave, former Prince of Dragonstone and Hand of the King, was Viserys and Daemon's father, and heir to the throne until his death from appendicitis, which is what spawned the Great Council of 101. Early on in the series, Otto compares Daemon to Maegor, and to those unfamiliar with the Targaryen family tree, it may not have meant much to you, but calling someone Maegor is a certified diss by Game of Thrones standards. Maegor I, also known as Maegor the Cruel, was the second son of Aegon the Conqueror, and also the third Targaryen king of Westeros. While he may have been the third king, when it comes to the most popular charts, he is definitely first, and he is essentially a mashup of some of the most famous names in history, such as Henry VIII and Richard III and Ivan the Terrible. Maegor liked to instill fear, even in his youth, due to his massive size and unforgiving nature. He would kill animals and even other children as a boy just for the sake of it. Basically, he's like a royal Michael Myers. In his adulthood, like the real-life Henry VIII, he went against the church and took 6 wives, though he didn't dissolve one marriage before taking on another. He took power after the death of his weaker older brother and even murdered his own nephew to prevent his claim to the throne. He was behind the creation of the Red Keep, and after it was finished, he had all the workers killed to preserve the secrets of its blueprints. By the end of his 6 tyrannical years in power, he'd managed to unite almost the entire realm against him. Everyone in the realm hated him until his death, where he was found dead on the Iron Throne, with many believing that the throne killed him, as it rejected him as leader. And did you notice? A similar thing seems to be happening with Viserys and all his cuts from the throne. As you know, one of Viserys' main hobbies is working on his grand model of Valyria. For those who don't know, Valyria was the old home of the likes of Targaryens and Valerians before they left for Westeros, as Daenerys Targaryen had a prophetic vision of the city's collapse, and this is exactly what happened, with the doomed city falling like Pompeii into ruin. Parallels can be drawn between Westeros and Valyria, with a prophetic vision involving a Targaryen and its downfall applicable for both, and the hubris and infighting for both leading to its very own demise.
So, there might have been a significant time jump between House of the Dragon episodes 5 and 6, with new cast members making their way into the fray, but in regards to power struggles, secret affairs, passive-aggressive conversations, insane family drama, Daemon being douchey but in a somehow charming way, and Viserys being in way over his head, everything was back to normal. In this video, we are going to go over some Easter eggs, hidden references, and callbacks you might have missed in episode 6, and what they might mean moving forward. And yes, there will be spoilers. When it comes to George R.R. Martin and the names of his characters, it can be somewhat of a mixed bag, well, in my subjective opinion anyway. You have the good like Daemon Targaryen, Arya Stark, and Tyrion Lannister. Then you have the bad, which employ comic book-like alliteration like Lancel Lannister, Prince Doran of Dorne, and Drogon the Dragon. Yes, I know why he's called Drogon, but still. And then you have the ugly, which are almost like normal names, but with an O instead of an E, like Joffrey and Andro. You also have the sublime, like Dickon Manwoody, which is just the perfect name, but that's for another day. Back to my original point. One of the best, or worst, depending on how you view it, named characters in Martin's works was referenced in episode 6, Grover Tully. Now, on its own, that name doesn't mean much, but that changes when you include the names of his descendants. Kermit, Elmo, and Oscar. Grover, Kermit, Elmo, and Oscar. Now, where have I heard those names before? Oh yeah. I kind of wish Martin continued on with this Muppet theme, like Fozzie Bear Mormont, Big Bird Stark, and Cookie Monster Lannister. Now those are some great names. Speaking of characters referenced with glorious names, in the moment where Laenor Velaryon is talking with Rhaenyra about the trouble brewing in the Stepstones and how he wishes to go back there and fight, he references a giant Tyroshi pirate with a purple beard who dresses up in women's frocks. Now, while I like to think it's a reference to Robert De Niro in Stardust, it is actually a reference to a Fire and Blood Easter egg and a direct reference to the character Ricalio Rhyndoon, the self-proclaimed king of the Narrow Sea, and he is easily one of the quirkiest characters in the book. For instance, he loved kittens but not cats, loved pregnant women but not children, ordered his wives to beat him, threw bones before a battle to decide which god to sacrifice to, and as referenced in the episode, dyes his beard and hair purple with orange streaks and occasionally dresses in frocks. Unfortunately though, this will likely be the last we hear of Rhyndoon, but it was a nice reference nonetheless. Oh, Viserys, you are as suited to being king as a Labrador is suited to being an accountant, and as every episode passes, his face looks more and more like that meme of Ben Affleck smoking. In terms of presence in the episode, Viserys is somewhat in the background in episode 6, with his health failing even more, his arm now fully gone, his Targaryen hair thinning, and his face aged significantly since the last time we saw him. But there's one heart-wrenching detail you might have missed at the end of the episode. As Larys monologues about the weakness children bring to a person's life, Viserys puts on a ring with a bird design and takes comfort in it. That ring belonged to his late wife Emma, and shows that despite the fact he has remarried and also made the choice to sacrifice her life in order to try and save the life of his son, he still mourns for her and loved her the most. Throughout the first 5 episodes of House of the Dragon, the decor on the walls had a strong theme of sex and dragons, which is essentially Game of Thrones in a nutshell. But anyway, in episode 6, the decor, particularly in Viserys' chambers, has changed to something a little more family-friendly, which suggests that Alicent has been slowly muting the Targaryen themes in the nation's capital. Also worth mentioning is that Alicent is still wearing the war color of House Hightower, green, along with her 2 sons Aegon and Aemond. While Rhaenyra's sons were dressed in the Targaryen colors of red and black. This again is setting up the 2 major factions, the Green and Blacks, during the infamous Dance of the Dragons, so make sure to keep an eye on the colors each character wears in the coming episodes. We saw Daemon make his play for Laena Velaryon in episode 5 after a flirty exchange at Rhaenyra's wedding, and since then the two have had a pair of children and taken off to Pentos, where Daemon is treated with the respect he desperately craves. Before her death during childbirth, Laena tells Daemon she wants to return to her family home of Driftmark to raise her children. Now, these story beats are pretty similar to Fire and Blood, but with a couple of differences. In Fire and Blood, the pair take off to Old Valyria to, quote, search out the secrets of the Dragon Lords of the Old Freehold, before going to Pentos, but instead of remaining there, they end up going together to Dragonstone and spending time with Rhaenyra. Laena does also end up dying during childbirth, but instead of being set on fire by her dragon, she gives birth to Daemon's son, only for him to die an hour later, before trying to fly Vhagar one last time, but dying on the way. As you saw in episode 6, Sir Harwin Strong is the illegitimate father of Rhaenyra's 3 sons, and it is seemingly no secret in King's Landing. In fact, Alicent's knowing line of, do keep trying, soon or late you may get one that looks just like you, to Laenor is taken straight out of the book. Non-book readers likely didn't see this relationship coming, as the pair really didn't have enough time together on screen, but there were some subtle moments of foreshadowing to their relationship, such as the look he gave her when she came back covered in boar's blood in episode 3, the moment he let her pass in episode 4, and when he saved her during the fracas at the wedding in episode 5. Keeping on with the Strongs, which sounds like a House of the Dragon version of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and now I can't not imagine Kylie taking down Kim and Kris in the same way that Larys did in House of the Dragon. Anyway, back to the Strongs. Harwin and Lionel's fiery demise is very similar to the book, but like a number of plot points in the series, it's less cut and dry in the book. While the show matter-of-factly states that Larys was behind their deaths to improve his standing in King's Landing, hey, that rhymed. This is only alluded to in the book, and there are also a number of other potential conspirators behind their deaths. One suggestion is that it was the Sea Snake, Corlys Velaryon, seeking vengeance against the man who had cuckolded his son. One theory suggests it was King Viserys, who was angry about the rumors between Harwin and his daughter, while another was that it was Harrenhal itself, which, as Larys states, supposedly haunted. Also, on the subject of Harrenhal, its smoldering ruins were first seen in Game of Thrones, but this is the first time we saw it fully standing. House of the Dragon is essentially a Doctor Who reunion with Steve Toussaint, Matthew Needham, and of course Matt Smith, all appearing in the classic show. But, did you catch the other Doctor Who connection? The teen version of Aegon Targaryen is played by Ty Tennant, who is the son of, in my opinion, the best Doctor of all time, David Tennant. Speaking of Aegon, one of the first scenes we see of him, he's, pleasuring himself while looking out at the view of King's Landing from his window, which is admittedly slightly better than what Tom and Baratheon did from that window. Now, this is a little contentious, but this scene reminds me of a particular moment from another amazing HBO show, Succession, where Roman Roy does a similar thing from his office window. To be honest, the characters have some similarities, such as being born into a prestigious position but generally uninterested with their duties, both like to wind up their siblings, and both have severe mother issues, so I can see it being intentional. Now, it wouldn't be House of the Dragon without actually having some dragons on display, and boy did we get our fill here. Firstly, we saw Vermax being tamed by Jace Valerian, while others referenced are Dreamfire and Sunfire. Also, the whole pig prank, which I assume is a play on the expression pigs can fly and perhaps carry, pig's blood, is a reference to Balerion, as Aegon calls the pig, quote, the Pink Dread, a play on Balerion's nickname of, quote, the Black Dread. But the main dragon on show in episode 5 is Vhagar, the oldest living dragon who was actually alive during Aegon the Conqueror's invasion of Westeros. If you remember back in episode 2, a young Laena asked King Viserys if he knew the whereabouts of the old dragon who was at the time missing. Flash forward nearly 2 decades, Vhagar has returned and has bonded with Laena, although it is unclear how this happened. If there is anyone who knows about the violent feud between the Brackens and the Blackwoods, it's Rhaenyra, as she witnessed the rivalry coming to a bloody head as they tried to win her hand at Storm's End. Flash forward over a decade and the rivalry is back in full swing, with the two families in a heated land dispute, and Rhaenyra suggesting that the small council look into this issue as they, quote, will use any excuse to spill each other's blood. In the book, this rivalry spans centuries, way before the Targaryens even came to Westeros, and after the conquering of the nation by the House of the Dragon, Queen Visenya, Aegon the Conqueror's sister wife, had to broker a double wedding between the two families in order to ensure peace in the realm. That peace did not last long, and look out for how that rivalry continues to boil away as the show goes on. If there is one thing the Valyrians love, even more than life itself, it is the sea, and in particular, sailing it. This is reflected in the way they talk, and their dialogue is usually riddled with nautical analogies. Take, for example, the moment that Laenor discusses the brewing trouble in the Stepstones, and how he longs to return to battle, but Rhaenyra says that he should stay and help deal with the issue of succession, and in particular the legitimacy of her children. Laenor says in response the line, quote, the wise sailor flees the storm as it gathers. Now this line may sound familiar to you, and for good reason, as it is similar to the line his father Corlys said to Viserys in episode 2 in regards to the issue of succession, with him saying, quote, to elude a storm, you can either sail into it or around it, but you must never await its coming. See, Valyrian men have only one thing on their mind, and it's disgusting: the sea. And finally, one notable character missing in episode 6 was that of the Sea Snake, who, if they follow the book, will prove himself as one of the best and most badass characters ever created by Martin. The character was nearly played by Danny Sapani before it went to Steve Toussaint, who has incidentally auditioned for multiple roles in Game of Thrones before being cast in the spin-off series.
Aegon! Tell me the truth of it!
Just like its predecessor, House of the Dragon Episode 7 is filled with high drama, political backstabbing, literal stabbing, rifts between families, and an uncomfortable relationship between Targaryen family members. In this video, we will take a look at some of the things you might have missed in the episode, and what it could all mean going forward. And yes, there will be spoilers. Let's first start off with the end of the episode, and the fake out of Laenor Valyrian's death. Obviously, romance has been brewing between Rhaenyra and Daemon for some time, but whether it be age, or a spouse, or an angry Viserys, there was always, as Kurt Cobain would say, something in the way. But during episode 7, the pair decided they could stay apart no more and would pave the way for their eventual union. With Daemon's former wives and Harwin Strong already meeting grisly ends, it seems that Rhaenyra's husband Laenor would also meet a similar fate, especially as Daemon conspired with his lover Carl. But instead of choosing violence, Rhaenyra and Daemon decided to spare Laenor, faking his death and shaving his hair, so he and Carl could flee under the cover of darkness for a life together in the East, with everyone ending up happy. Well, except for Corlys and Rhaenys, who presumed that their son had been murdered, and the random guy whose neck Daemon snapped. But otherwise, happy days for everyone involved. However, this is somewhat different from the book. Now, while House of the Dragon has for the most part stayed loyal to the source material, Fire and Blood, as we have mentioned in other videos, there have been times where they have diverged, and in particular where the book has been ambiguous as to the details of events. House of the Dragon has been much more cut and dry. That is the case in the book for Laenor's death as well. As Laenor did die in the book, the true conspirator behind his murder was unknown. As written by Martin, Sir Laenor Velaryon, husband to the Princess Rhaenyra and the putative father of her children, was slain whilst attending a fair in Spicetown, stabbed to death by his friend and companion Sir Coral Corey. The two men had been quarreling loudly before blades were drawn. Merchants at the fair told Lord Velaryon when he came to collect his son's body. Corey had fled by then, wounding several men who tried to hinder him. Some claimed a ship had been waiting for him offshore. He was never seen again. Similar to the show though, while it is never confirmed, it is heavily inferred that Daemon was behind the murder. Now this is actually a reference to episode 6, but we didn't cover it at the time because it would have been spoilers. But Aemon losing his eye was foreshadowed early on. When we first meet his sister Helena in episode 6, she was playing with a collection of bugs and talking in cryptic sentences, which was all pretty creepy to be honest. As she listened to her brother Aemon talk to Alicent about his desire for a dragon, Helena says, "He will have to close an eye."
He'll have to close an eye.
Flash forward to episode 7 and Aemon does indeed gain a dragon after bonding with the old Vhagar, but in return loses an eye after a scuffle with his nephews. The scuffle and the loss of the eye will definitely come up again, but more on that later. Helena is seemingly another member of the Targaryen house to have dragon dreams. Dragon dreams affect those with the blood of the dragon, who are known to have premonition-like dream abilities, and they often involve dragons, but not always. Also, if you listen to what she says after the funeral in episode 7, she's fixated on the loom of fate weaving threads of black and threads of green, which is of course a reference to the upcoming Dance of Dragons, suggesting she has had prophetic dreams to the Targaryen civil war. I imagine that's how all book readers feel watching the show. As Rhaenyra becomes more and more powerful and confident in her role as heir, her look is designed to reflect that, and in particular, her hair. As the episodes go by, the braids of the hair of the heir, gotta love the English language sometimes, have become more and more bold and intricate, reflecting Rhaenyra's demeanor as a whole. This is very similar to Daenerys in Game of Thrones, who also wore more intricate braids as the show went on, and she continued to pick up victories against her foes. Although this is admittedly linked to the Dothraki tradition as opposed to Targaryen custom. Whether or not Rhaenyra is sporting her hair to mirror the Dothrakis, or if it's just an Easter egg to her descendant Daenerys is unclear. But either way, it's a nice touch, and I am intrigued to see what her hair will look like in the season finale. I'm expecting a full model of King's Landing or a Targaryen family tree weaved into her hair. As we mentioned, as the show ramps up to the infamous Dance of the Dragons and the war between the green and the black factions, we can expect to see them wearing their side's colors proudly for the world to see. In episode 7, once again the House of the Dragon youngsters are wearing their team's colors, with Alicent's children Aegon and Aemond wearing green, the war color of House Hightower, which makes them look more like Malfoys than Targaryens, while Rhaenyra's children continue to wear the red and black of House Targaryen. Continue to keep an eye on the colors the characters wear as we approach the finale. Okay, I did consider dropping this one as it is spoilery, but I will try to keep it as spoiler-free as possible. As we mentioned, Aemon loses an eye after having a scuffle with his nephews Jace and Lucerys after he bonded with Vhagar, and in the aftermath of the fight, Alicent calls for the eye of one of the boys in return. Now, as you can guess, this will not be the last of the feud between the boys, especially as they are in the opposing factions, and this whole eye for an eye call will come to a head in one of the most memorable moments in the book. And the string of events that took place in episode 7 will have a massive knock-on effect when it comes to Dance of the Dragons. But that's all I'm saying right now, because we are entering spoiler territory. After Lyanna's return to the sea, the Targaryen family members converse awkwardly amongst themselves, and there is a bunch of information flung around in this short period of time that you might have missed. In particular, the upcoming Green Wedding. As Aegon chats with his younger brother, he complains about the fact that he has to marry his sister Helaena, claiming that she is odd, while Aemon says he would have no qualms marrying her if it were for the good of House Targaryen. In the previous episode, Rhaenyra suggested marrying Helaena to her son Jace in a bid to bury the hatchet, but in reality protect the legitimacy of her sons, which Viserys was all for. But this is knocked back by Alicent as she planned to marry Helaena to her son Aegon to shore up the family bloodlines. As we said, this green wedding will happen, and be likely less traumatic as other Game of Thrones weddings. But that's all we'll say on the matter. As we saw, Aemon finally has his dragon, and as both he and his grandfather Otto mentioned, having Vhagar on their side is a massive win for the Greens, seeing as Vhagar is one of the biggest and oldest dragons around. But how exactly did Aemon convince a dragon like Vhagar, one who had been initially missing for some time, to bond with him? Well, it turns out Aemon was paying close attention to what his siblings and nephews were taught in the Dragon Pit in episode 6, as he utters the exact same phrases they learned in order to bring the dragon to heel. The first thing Aemon says to Vhagar is Daharis, the High Valyrian word for serve. Now, for all of you Throne fans, that word may sound familiar, and for good reason, as Valar Daharis means all men must serve, and it's a phrase that often answers Valar Morghulis, which means all men must die, which you likely heard a few times in Game of Thrones. Daharis is used on the dragons the same way the word heel is used for dogs, and it's the same word Rhaenyra says to Syrax in episode 1, to calm the dragon down, and it's how Jace brought Vermax to heel in episode 6. Although Aegon may be the oldest, Aemon's actions in episode 7 show that he is not only the most tenacious youngster out of the group, that he is also one of the biggest threats to Rhaenyra and the Blacks, especially as he now rides Vhagar. While some similarities can be drawn between the Greyjoys and the Valyrians, especially their relationship to the sea, one of the biggest differences is to whom they choose to worship. The Greyjoys in Game of Thrones worship the drowned god at the Iron Islands, while the people who come from lands around the Narrow Sea worship a god called the Merling King, who the Valyrians claim gave them the Driftwood Throne. The Merling King is an ancient demigod who seemingly ruled over the waters and islands in the Narrow Sea, and his name is likely a reference to being a merman as opposed to the wizard from Arthurian tales. In Game of Thrones, there is a ship named after the demigod, and it is the ship that Sansa and Littlefinger board to escape King's Landing after the death of Joffrey. Of course, our attention has been focused on the trouble of succession once Viserys kicks the bucket and who will rule Westeros after him. But there is one line of succession that is also in doubt, that of who will ascend the Driftwood throne after the Sea Snake dies. With Laenor presumed dead and Lyanna actually dead, Corlys's line is in doubt. And although he is lining up Lucerys to rule Driftmark someday, he is less than enthused. And on top of that, there are many in the Valyrian household who do not want to see Rhaenyra's illegitimate children ruling in their name. While Corlys is seemingly content with focusing on the name of the children as opposed to their blood, continue to keep an eye on the difficult times of merging in Driftmark, especially as the events of the Dance of the Dragons unfold. Oh Viserys, in the words of Mark Corrigan, you're not a bad person, but I'm afraid to say you are a moron. While in Game of Thrones, they said that it's the people who don't want to lead that make the better rulers, that isn't necessarily always the case. And Viserys' inability to keep all his ducks in a row is causing escalating tensions in Westeros. Part of the reason Viserys is struggling is that he is still pining over his late wife, Aemma, something which we saw in episode 6 as he wept while holding her ring. To show that Aemma is still always on his mind, as he heads off to bed after Lyanna's funeral, he calls Alicent Emma by mistake, loud enough so basically the whole court could hear this major moment of embarrassment. Sir Harold Westerling quickly attempts to save the situation by asking, "Shall I see after Queen Alicent, your grace?" But the moment is already enough to make everyone awkward. But what are the effects of this Freudian slip? Well, it could make Alicent question her place as queen and the hold she has over Viserys, while it also suggests that Viserys' mental capabilities are beginning to fade, which can be added to his ever-growing list of ailments. It's just a good thing he didn't say Rachel. And ending on a general piece of trivia, the Driftmark Valyrian theme is the same melody as the song, It's Always Summer Under the Sea, that Princess Shireen sings in Game of Thrones. In the book, she learned this song from her fool Patchface, who supposedly spent time with the Sea People after being shipwrecked.
I will sit the throne today,
With more backstabbing, dragon eggs, violence, hidden meanings, and passive-aggressive comments, it's safe to say that episode 8 was another strong episode.
Jace.
Whoops, sorry Jason Luke. That's why we are going to unpack all of the Easter eggs, hidden references, callbacks to Game of Thrones, and changes from the book in this video, and hopefully not start any civil wars in the process. And yes, there will be spoilers in this video. Let's start off with one of the most brutal moments of the show, the death of Vaemond Valerian, who played a little bit too close to the fire in the episode. Now, for the most part, this scene is plucked straight out of the books, but there are a couple of differences. Similar to how it is in the show, in the book, Corlys' line of succession is called into question after his health begins to fail, and Vaemond takes the opportunity to insult Rhaenyra's children and their legitimacy. However, unlike in the show, Rhaenyra is the one that calls for Vaemond's head, and Daemon delivers just that before feeding the rest of his body to his dragon, Syrax. Then, King Viserys orders the removal of Vaemond's cousin's tongues to stop spreading the rumors about Rhaenyra's children. Also, fun fact, Vaemond is Corlys' nephew in the book, not his brother. Another slight change from the book is the state of Viserys' health. In the book, he does suffer with ill health, namely gout, which causes him to struggle to ascend the Iron Throne, but this is when things really change. After he orders the removal of Vaemond's cousin's tongues, he falls and cuts his hand on the throne right down to the bone, which soon becomes infected, and he is gripped by a fever. However, his health recovers, and Rhaenyra returns from Dragonstone, and they have a great unifying feast to celebrate this. Unlike the show, where Viserys notes that he is not long for this world, and it's essentially his final meal with his family before he kicks the bucket. One reference to the book comes with Alicent's relationship to an ailing King Viserys, which is reminiscent to her relationship with his father, Jaehaerys, as Alicent took care of him on his deathbed, and the old king would often mistake her for one of his own daughters. You probably caught this one, but as the animosity had finally started to fade away after some nice words were shared at King Viserys' feast, after he left, anarchy ensued once again due to more fighting between Aemond and his nephews. During a passive-aggressive speech, Aemond, who has aged like 20 years since we last saw him, is played by Osferith from The Last Kingdom now, so would you look at that? Not so subtly once again called into question Jace, Luke, and Joffrey's parentage by calling them strong boys over and over again. But you might have missed the slight that started it all off in the first place. As Viserys leaves the dining hall, a roast pig is brought in at the exact same time and placed in front of Aemond, which causes Luke to laugh. The reason he found this so funny was because it was a reference to the prank Aegon and his nephews played on Aemond back in episode 6, where they presented him with a pig with wings, nicknamed the Pink Dread, as a joke for his, at the time, lack of having his own dragon. While we have mentioned some differences between the book and the show already in this video, the feast scene was almost taken directly from the book, as the two factions did actually share a moment of peace, with even Daemon complimenting Otto, who also complimented him in turn, before the night devolves into Aemond's slide on his nephews and Jace dancing with Helaena. Speaking of Helaena, as well as providing great jokes at her husband Aegon's expense, she was back with another ominous prophecy, uttering the words,
Beware the beast beneath the boards.
"Beware the beast beneath the boards." But what does this mean exactly? Well, that's actually unclear, and it could mean multiple things. It could be a reference to Mysaria, aka the White Worm, who we saw scheming away in the shadows. It could be a reference to the upcoming Dance of Dragons, or it could be a reference to one of the most horrific moments in the book, blood and cheese. But we are not going to go in on that, as that would be spoilers. However, going back an entry, do keep an eye, no offense Aemond, on the prince's simmering tensions with his nephews, and in particular, Daemon. So as Game of Thrones takes place over 100 years after House of the Dragon, other than nods to the Song of Ice and Fire and the Prince that was promised, a moment where Alicent mistakenly thinks Viserys is referring to her son Aegon and the line of succession, there aren't going to be any direct references to the series, but there are some subtle indirect ones. After learning he sexually assaulted one of his chambermaids, Alicent confronts an uncaring Aegon and tells him that he is no son of mine. Now, while this may feel like an exchange that would take place between Joffrey and Cersei, it is actually a reference to a moment between another pair of Lannisters. Yes, I called Joffrey a Lannister, not a Baratheon, and I'm sticking to it.
We'll never do it again.
As Tyrion confronts his father on the privy, Tywin utters the very same words to Tyrion before his disowned son kills him once and for all. In the episode, we see two forms of tea that you wouldn't want served to you at your local Starbucks, and they both importantly represent character development in the season. The first tea in question is known as the Moon Tea and is, for lack of a better term, the Westerosi equivalent of the morning after pill, and it is the drink that Alicent gives Diana after she was assaulted by Aegon to prevent her bearing an illegitimate child. What makes this even more important is that it shows how far along in the Game of Thrones, as in the Game for the Throne, not the other show, Alicent is, as she was originally appalled by Rhaenyra taking the tea poppy after her fling with Sir Criston, but is now seemingly less concerned about doling out the tea in order to protect her son's reputation and prevent the line of succession to become even murkier. The second tea in question is the one created from the milk of the poppy, the Westerosi version of morphine, which is used to treat pain, but in large doses can be fatal. King Viserys is shown to be very doped out on the substance, which is making his already ailing mind even more fragile, and has allowed Alicent and her father Otto to rule in his stead. Milk of the poppy was used multiple times in Game of Thrones, such as King Robert after he was left mortally injured by a boar. For the first time in Game of Thrones lore, we saw the process of collecting dragon eggs, and what happens after they are laid in the scene where Daemon is thrilled to learn that Syrax has laid a clutch of 3 eggs. Now, while we won't go into the specifics, those dragon eggs will be very important moving forward, as not only does it give the Black faction 3 more dragons, but one of them will likely become the dragon Morning, who plays an important part in the story moving forward, but we will not go into further detail than that. After the name slip in the previous episode, with Viserys calling Alicent Emma, Alicent makes one of her own. As she speaks to a knight of the Kingsguard, she mistakenly calls them Sir Auric, before he corrects her that it's actually Eric. But this isn't just her getting his name wrong, it's actually an introduction to the Cargills, Auric and Eric, who are identical twins and both members of the Kingsguard. What makes this even more important is that the twins find themselves on opposing sides during the infamous Dance of the Dragons. Speaking of those factions, the green and black colors were seen throughout the episode with Alicent and Otto wearing green while Rhaenyra and her children were dressed in black. But there was another character importantly wearing black, Rhaenys. Before King Viserys made his dramatic entrance, it seemed like Rhaenys would side with the Hightowers, assuming they would strike the first major blow on Rhaenyra and her children's claim to the throne. But after Viserys' arrival, she makes a pivot to side with Rhaenyra, betrothing her grandchildren to Rhaenyra's sons, and becoming a major player for the Black faction. Also, it's worth mentioning that the only person who went to meet Rhaenyra and Daemon was Lord Caswell, which is not only a subtle slight by Otto, but shows us how little allies Rhaenyra currently has in King's Landing. As we saw in the episode, Jace is taking his role as the eventual heir to the throne very seriously, and with his legitimacy in question, he is noticeably insecure about his claim, so he is desperately trying to learn High Valyrian in order to prove himself as a true descendant of House Targaryen and Valyrian. But the lines of High Valyrian that he is learning also act as a Westerosi history lesson, as he recounts the moment Aegon the Conqueror first landed in the Seven Kingdoms, reaching the Blackwater Rush unopposed, which would later become the city of King's Landing, and building the Aegon Fort. Speaking of Aegon's conquest, in order to unify the Seven Kingdoms and become accepted as king, he disavowed the old gods and converted to the faith of the Seven, although the Targaryens still maintain and meet at the Godswood, such as Rhaenyra and Rhaenys, showing their links to the old gods are still there. On the other side of the coin though, Alicent is showing her devotion to the faith of the Seven, decorating the Red Keep with a 7-pointed star and wearing one proudly, all of which once again shows the deep divide between the two factions. As we know, 6 years have passed since episode 7 and episode 8, and Rhaenyra and Daemon have been busy in that time, marrying and having 2 sons of their own. The pair introduced their sons to Viserys, and us, saying their names are Aegon and Viserys. Now, while these are typical Targaryen names, they are very important for multiple reasons. Firstly, calling their son Aegon is definitely a slight at Alicent naming her son Aegon, but it is also a reference to Viserys and Daemon's older brother Aegon, who was originally destined for the throne before he died, which makes Varys' second son, Line to Vaemond, even more ironic. Also, I really want to go into the hidden meaning behind Viserys' line of, "That's a name fit for a king," but that unfortunately would be spoilers, so I will go no further. Another form of conflict between the Blacks and the Green is their links to the Maesters. For example, when it's revealed the Maesters have been helping with Viserys' health on the orders of Alicent, Rhaenyra and Daemon scoff that of course the Maesters have been helping them. The reason they do this is because House Hightower has a long history with them. In fact, one of the titles that comes with being Lord of Hightower is Defender or Protector of the Citadel, and the house has actually been long established as a patron of the Order of Maesters. The Hightowers even helped found the Citadel, and it's funded by Old Town taxes, which, yes, run through the Hightowers as well, so you can understand why Daemon and Rhaenyra are skeptical of them. One of the most eye-catching features in episode 8 is Viserys' mask, which makes him look like he's about to abduct a girl named Christine and flee to the depths of the Opera House. And, like most plot points in House of the Dragons and Game of Thrones, has a link to real-life history. Viserys' illness is likely leprosy, which has severely disfigured his face and caused him to lose an eye. This connects him to King Baldwin IV, who served as King of Jerusalem from 1174 to 1185, and like Viserys, ruled while having the disease, leading him to become known as the Leper King and and was left blind by it. However, while in imagery the king is depicted as wearing a silver mask similar to the one sported by Viserys, there is actually no physical evidence to suggest he did in fact wear one. And finally, this is actually some early season trivia. But while we don't see Viserys and Alicent tying the knot in the show, their wedding was actually filmed. However, it seemingly didn't make it off the cutting room floor due to time constraints.
I have found out something you should know. In the end, benefit you.
You did well, Lord Harris.
So, after 8 episodes of plot building and watching a man slowly die in front of our eyes, Episode 9 escalated the conflict tenfold, with the Green faction striking the first blow in the race for the throne. In this video, we will go over all the tiny details you might have missed amongst the action, and what exactly it all means. And yes, there will be major spoilers for Episode 9.
You are the beast beneath the boards. There is a beast beneath the boards.
As we've explained before, the House of the Dragon opening credits is a constantly shifting Targaryen family tree, with the flow of blood telling us who is dead and who is alive in the show. What makes this episode different is that it is the first time that the opening credits have shown unique symbols for Alicent, Aegon, Aemond, and Helaena. Alicent's symbol is the crest of House Hightower, with a 7-pointed star showing her affiliation with her faith. Aegon's symbol is that of a dragon egg and a woman. Helena's is a spider, while Aemond's is a sapphire. But one line you might have missed is to Alicent and Viserys' 4th child. Yes, that's right, they had another one without you even realizing it. Showrunner Ryan Condal said that Viserys' 4th child, Daeron, would not work in a first season, but the prince who is living off screen with Otto's brother in Old Town will presumably have a part to play down the line. So in the last video, we were speculating on what Helena's ominous prophecy meant of the beast beneath the floorboards, a line she says once again in episode 9. Now, we hate to say it, but we were basically wrong with all our guesses, and it turned out the obvious meaning was the right answer, as it was a reference to the dragon beneath the floorboards at Aegon's coronation. In the closing moments of the episode, Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys bust out under the floorboards and stare down Alicent and Aegon, threatening to kill them all and end the conflict before it even gets going. But instead decides to fly off, as she seemingly has a soft spot for Alicent. This scene is important, however, as it shows once again that Helaena is spot on in her predictions. Speaking of which, did anyone catch the other quick prophecy she made in the episode? As she watches her newly introduced children play with their toys, she utters the line,
One possesses a thing, the other will take it away.
If one possesses a thing, the other will take it away. Now, this is of course referring to the children playing, but it also has a double meaning. Now, we can't get into specifics as that will be spoilers, but you can pretty much guarantee that line essentially summarizes the upcoming carousel of throne sitters and the Dance of the Dragons. In episode 9, we were introduced to Aegon's children through marriage, but we were also introduced to one of his illegitimate children too, down in Flea Bottom, which, as the twins speculate, is likely one of many. Now, all of this is very similar to Robert Baratheon in Game of Thrones, and the likes of his Gendry. However, this is actually likely setting up a relatively important character in the book, and this child is likely Gaemon Palehair. Now again, we won't go into specifics as that would be spoilers, but in the book it is revealed that Gaemon is the son of Aegon II, and a woman named Essie who worked in a brothel in King's Landing. Gaemon is raised in said brothel as if he were in fact the next in line, and does actually draw a cult following of supporters, but that's as far as we will go because, as I said, spoilers. As you know, Episode 9 focuses on the Greens' mad rush to secure Aegon as king and cement their power after the death of Viserys, a plan they had been working on for some time, although there is still some infighting between Alicent and Otto in the Green faction. Anyway, although they do their best to keep Viserys' death a secret, something which they do over the course of several days while the corpse rots away in the book, the White Worm learns about the death of the king and abducts Aegon while the Greens have a literal search for the heir to the throne. But how exactly did the White Worm learn about Viserys' death? Well, it was likely the candles that Talia lit and placed in the window to inform the White Worm from afar. This is seemingly a nod to Game of Thrones, with Sansa using the same system to ask Brienne for help. Speaking of the White Worm though, while it isn't confirmed, her building being set on fire was likely performed by Larys on the orders of Otto in order to stop her from getting one over on the hand again down the line. But we will have to wait and see if that was the case and if the White Worm managed to get out of there alive. I do wonder though if Otto paid Larys the same way Alicent does. While House of the Dragon is a spin-off of Game of Thrones, did anyone catch the reference to another Game of Thrones spin-off? When looking for Aegon, Aemond mentions that he could have boarded a ship to Yi Ti. Yi Ti is located in Essos, to the east of Korth, and inspired by the real-world Imperial China. Yi Ti is a vast empire, ruled over by leaders who are known as God Emperors, and is one of the largest and oldest nations in the known world. It is also the setting of an upcoming animated series, although at the moment very little is known about the project. Another subtle reference, actually two of them, comes in the late-night small council meeting to go over the upcoming struggle for power and Aegon's succession. The first is a reference to the southern nation of Dorne, with Tywin Lannister asking, was Dorne invaded, as he speculates why the meeting is so urgent. This is a subtle reminder that at this point in history, Dorne isn't part of the Seven Kingdoms. Dorne actually resisted Aegon the Conqueror's invasion and didn't become conquered and officially part of the Seven Kingdoms until 187 AC, with House of the Dragon taking place over 50 years earlier. Another location referenced in the meeting is that of the Baratheon home of Storm's End, which is conveyed to be an important seat for both the Greens and Blacks. This is actually set up for an upcoming plotline which ends with an epic dragon battle, but saying anything more would be major spoilers, so again, we will end here. Another important moment in the meeting is when Sir Harold Westerling casts down his white cloak and leaves his role as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, as he is shocked and horrified by the events of that meeting, and in particular the behavior of fellow member of the Kingsguard Criston and his severe rage problem. Now, to be honest, his future is a bit of an enigma. While he did allude to the fact that he would side with the Blacks, in the book, Harold Westerling has been long dead, dying before Rhaenyra and Laenor got married, so it is rather unclear what the future holds for the character. Also, his defiance in going to kill Rhaenyra in Dragonstone is a nice callback to the first episode, where he is sworn in as her protector, with him being a man of his word. Unlike Criston, always mad about something, Cole. Speaking of Sir Criston and his never-ending angst, once again, he kills a character in pointless and brutal fashion, this time murdering Lyman Beesbury by smashing his head down onto one of the balls used by the small council. Now in the book, Beesbury dies at a similar point, but there are multiple conflicting accounts of what happened. One claims he was sent to the Black Cells and died there, another that Criston Cole slit his throat, while a third says Criston threw him out a window onto spikes below. Now while it wasn't quite as brutal as the third option in the show, it was definitely a bloody start for the first major death in the dance, with Lord Caswell, the only person to welcome Rhaenyra and Daemon in episode 8, being the second. You may have noticed during Aegon's coronation, a few of the banners include a gold dragon on black, rather than the typical red of House Targaryen. This is because it's Aegon's personal sigil, with the gold in honor of his own golden dragon, Sunfire, who is said to be the most beautiful in the world. There is also a deeper purpose to this though. Having different banners will allow the factions to know who they're attacking when the eventual war begins. For her part, Rhaenyra, if it follows the book, will use the House Targaryen dragon quartered with the falcon of House Arryn and the seahorse of House Valerian for her sigil. Speaking of the coronation though, Aegon is fitted with the crown and sword of his namesake Aegon the Conqueror in order to legitimize his claim for the throne. Now both of these items, which are made from Valyrian steel, are missing during Game of Thrones, but they are very important during the events of the dance. Aegon is actually the first king to wear the crown since Maegor the Cruel, while the sword was wielded by one of the most popular monarchs in Game of Thrones history, King Jaehaerys. All of this again is to associate Aegon II with his ancestors to showcase him as the better choice. But while we were all focusing on one crown, there is another crown that will also hold a great level of importance, Viserys' crown. In the episode, we see his crown laid on his body, presumably set for the funeral pyre, but we importantly never see it be destroyed. That's because in the book, it is smuggled out of King's Landing, and placed in the hands of, well, spoilers. There have been multiple references and dialogue to Game of Thrones throughout the series, and episode 9 was no different, giving us various callbacks to the show. The White Worm's line of, "There is no power but what the people allow you to take," is reminiscent of Varys' line,
"Power resides where men believe it resides."
While Larys also refers to spiders in the White Worm, which was Varys' nickname in Game of Thrones. While Alicent's line to Otto of, "None of this is a game," is a stark contrast, pun intended, to Game of Thrones Season 1, where Cersei Lannister tells Ned Stark, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." One of the main inciting incidents of the episode is Alicent misinterpreting Varys' meaning behind the prophecy of ice and fire, thinking he meant he wanted to see Aegon on the throne. Of course, he didn't mean this at all, and was referring to the prince that was promised, aka Jon Snow, over 100 years later, but Alicent takes this and runs with it to give her son a legitimate reason to rule. However, this is a major deviation from the books, as firstly, the Song of Ice and Fire wasn't mentioned by Viserys, and secondly, Alicent's motive was much more plain. She believed Aegon's claim to be stronger, or more self-serving, than Rhaenyra's. Now, while the Bells episode was one of the best-looking episodes in Game of Thrones history, it was also one of the most controversial, as Daenerys lays waste to the city of King's Landing, despite the bells ringing out for surrender. However, it has never been established in Game of Thrones lore that the ringing of the bells means that, but House of the Dragon does use them correctly to signify the death of a monarch. As Viserys once said, "I've always hated the bells. They ring for horror, a dead king, a city under siege." Speaking of Dany though, one of her catchphrases in the later seasons of Game of Thrones was to tell Jon Snow to bend the knee every 5 minutes, and this is seemingly referenced in House of the Dragon, with bend the knee being said multiple times, with one reference saying that Rhaenyra would never bend the knee to Aegon. And finally, as Aemon searches for his brother, he not so subtly alludes that he wouldn't be that concerned if they never find his brother, so he could take over as next in line. The only thing is he isn't the next in line. He has seemingly forgotten that Aegon and Helaena have had children, making them next in line. To be fair, they were only on screen for a minute, but let's face it, he's not winning the Uncle of the Year award. Daemon already won that. Sometimes you can try as hard as you can to avoid war. Then your half-brother's dragon eats your second-born, and it's time for some dragon dancing. We've all been there, right? The slow march to war has finally reached its point of no return. For 9 episodes, the Bloodlines in the House of Dragons have been positioning and scheming and dealing, trying to position themselves to take power while avoiding war. Of course, we knew war was inevitable, and it even has a cool name, Dance of Dragons. Let's see what else we know. Any tabletop gamer will tell you that a sweet gaming table can make all the difference. When it comes to battle plans, it stands to reason whose subtitle is The Conqueror is gonna have a sweet table. Daemon Targaryen starts planning the war he's wanted all along, while his wife and rightful heir is looking for a peaceful way out. Either way, it takes counting resources on a map. Aegon the Conqueror's table map, seen first in Game of Thrones Season 2, Episode 1, when Stannis Baratheon holds a council meeting and it's used as a table. This time though, we see the killer feature of the table, a fire pit beneath it that lights up the features of the map. Probably why all those house markers are dragonglass. If they were metal, they'd eventually get pretty hot when it comes time to move them. So yeah, I'd say the science checks out on this one. We haven't really gotten to see much dragon-on-dragon action, even if Rule 34 can prove otherwise, which is a bummer because the war is referred to as the Dance of Dragons, but that's over now. The Dance of Dragons has finally had its Lusitania or Gulf of Tonkin moment when Aemond and Luke find out that you don't goof around with a pair of apex predators. One of the highlights of the conflict is a moment when Vhagar flies over Arax and we see how big Vhagar is, especially to the adolescent Arax. Arax almost fits entirely in Vhagar's mouth, cause she checked. When it comes to dragons, bigger is better. That means that despite the numbers advantage the blacks have on the greens, Vhagar has size on everyone, but there are some heavyweights yet to weigh in. The first is a little interlude when Daemon sings a lullaby to a mysterious dragon in a cave. Well, mysterious unless you have the subtitles on. It's Vermithor, Jaehaerys Targaryen's former dragon. Jaehaerys was the longest running Targaryen to rule, sitting on the throne for 55 years, meaning Vermithor had a chance to grow into a big boy. Not as big as Vhagar, but every bit counts. But wait, there's more. Daemon gives a breakdown of the dragons at their disposal, and 3 of them are wild ones. That's Sheepstealer, Grey Ghost, and Cannibal. Not really hard to see who the most concerning one is. Unless, of course, you're a sheep. It's not hard to sort out Cannibal's favorite snack. He's the biggest of the wild dragons, and the one least into being ridden, having eaten that last person to try. What he loses in size to Vhagar, he makes up for it in ferocity. Now they just have to hope he eats the right dragons. Hereditary monarchies are tricky, especially when the heir has to be a male. Puts a lot of pressure on the old swimmers. Viserys is deciding that the whole gender restriction thing that allowed him to jump ahead in line when it came to Rhaenys and named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, has set in motion what will eventually become the Dance of Dragons. Despite having her son undercut Rhaenyra for the throne, Alicent is about as reluctant for the war as are Rhaenys and Rhaenyra. Hoping to capitalize on that, she sends Otto Hightower to offer up terms if she'll get with the program and bend the knee. Hoping to remind Rhaenyra of better times when they were friends reading storybooks together, Alicent returns the page that was torn out of the book they read when they were kids. It might have worked, except for that whole second-born being eaten thing, kind of a deal breaker. The original Game of Thrones opening sequence would give us a Clockwork Rising map that would tell us what parts of Westeros would come into play in the episode, as well as where Daenerys was with her growing army. House of the Dragon, since it deals with the admittedly narrow Targaryen bloodlines, instead gives us the various sigils that are connected by literal blood. Well, depicted blood. Aemon's sigil has been a sapphire. Readers of the book have known why, but for the rest of us, it was revealed when he led on that he has not gotten over losing his eye after teasing Rhaenyra's kids and demanding an eye. Because when you're demanding someone pluck their own eye out, you gotta add some flair. So he takes the patch off to reveal that he's stuffed a sapphire in the empty slot. Little does he know how much it makes him look like a White Walker. One of the ways a narrative can demonstrate where it ends compared to where it began is to draw visual parallels between the beginning and the ending, like how Game of Thrones began and ended with people waiting to go through the tunnel at the wall. The first episode of House of the Dragon ends with a teenage Rhaenyra staring straight down the barrel of the camera after her dad's proclamation unwittingly sets his family and country on a collision course with civil war. After Rhaenyra gets the bad news about Luke, she finally turns and faces the camera again with a resolve that screams, "Time to dance." With dragons, that is. Rhaenyra's boys step up when it comes to the preparations for war when they offer to deliver in-person messages to the Baratheons and Starks that war is on the horizon and Rhaenyra would like them to honor their family's vows of loyalty. Dragons fly faster than ravens and the boys have their mom's reluctance to just start fighting, so they hope the personal touch might do the job. It's hard to argue with that logic. As she sends her boys off in their mission of diplomacy, there's a bit of a familiar music cue. It's the one that accompanied Daenerys when she first flew her dragon. Turns out that was not a good sign. The Baratheons loomed large over the Song of Ice and Fire. They're the ones that got the ball rolling with Robert's rebellion. Then, the infidelity of his wife, who makes Lady Macbeth look like a PTA president, set into motion another civil war when Baratheon's best friend figured out his kids weren't his kids. Then his brothers tried separately to take his seat. Despite all of that, we never got to see the Baratheons in their home, the Stormlands. But what better place for a dragon-on-dragon fight than a place called the Stormlands? So when Luke is sent to shore up the loyalty of the Baratheons, we finally get to see the Stormlands, which certainly lived up to the name. We have gotten through 10 episodes of a show set in Westeros and no one has given us an update on winter and whether it's coming or not. That actually matters more than it sounds like. Seasons work weird on the planet Westeros is on. Well, Rhaenyra sent her oldest to have a chat with Cregan Stark, because they're closer in age. Since there isn't a war-starting encounter with the Starks, but that just means that Cregan Stark is in the wings, ready to be the same humorless voice of duty we've come to expect from a Stark in Season 2. This isn't actually the first time that this has been alluded to in the season, but it's just too fun not to mention. Among the families they were trying to count on their side came the Tullys. They're previously known as the family Lady Stark came from before she went north to become a Stark. Prior to that, though, the names all seem to resemble the names of a certain street down Public Television Way. The current head of the family is Grover. No big deal. There's been a Grover president. It's a name. His son is Elmo. Another relative, Oscar. George R.R. Martin gave the Tullys Muppet names. I mean, after having to double check if I got Rhaenyra or Rhaenys right each time, I really am all for Sesame Street names at this point. It seems like Rhaenyra keeps meeting Otto under the worst circumstances. In episode 2, when Daemon was holding a dragon egg as a bargaining tool, they met on a bridge at Dragonstone with Rhaenyra making an entrance by flying in on a dragon. But I mean, who can blame her? If I had a dragon to let me ride it, I'd obviously make all my entrances on a dragon. And I'd probably name him Komodo. Anyway, Otto brings the terms for Rhaenyra to accept the rule of Aegon's second of his name. Really long way of saying that. And ends up on the same bridge with Rhaenyra making the same entrance, only this time with a touch more of threat. There's a lot of lore and speculation that goes into why it is exactly that Targaryens seem to be able to commune with dragons enough that they can ride them into battle. Part of that is the speculation that they literally mix their blood with the dragons that makes them connected to the dragons and at least makes Daenerys fireproof. To make sure that blood remains strong in the family, they keep it in the family, so to speak. Their family tree doesn't have a lot of branches. It could be the incest, it could be the actual dragon blood, but according to the lore, the Targaryens occasionally have stillborn children that seem like human-dragon hybrids. In the oral history that Fire and Blood is, that's how Rhaenyra's stillborn child is described, complete with vestigial wings. That could be because Fire and Blood is written as a history passed down from various sources. Basically a story told by someone who heard the story from someone who heard the story from someone who was told about the thing from someone who was supposedly there. So the accounts don't always agree. Which might actually account for another key change. In the episode, it's clear not only that Aemon is just messing with his nephew, but that the actual violence came when they both lost control of their dragons, something foreshadowed when talking about the Targaryens losing purpose and therefore control of the dragons. In the book, it's implied that Aemon not only killed Luke on purpose, he kept the head as a trophy. But since it's the opening of a war, it's defined in terms of the war. No one wants to say they tore their family and country apart over a couple of misunderstandings. One of the key areas to secure early on when the north of Westeros decided it had had enough of being part of the south, with the current leader beheading Eddard Stark and all, securing River Run was key as it was a choke point for the continent. or a big island. That's never really clear. Anyway, the need for control of the Riverlands and Robb Stark's stupid romantic heart leads to the Red Wedding. When discussing controlling supply routes in their quest to regain the throne, Riverrun is again an important location. Just be careful about any betrothals. When you have dragons, it seems like the ultimate weapon. The problem is, it's not exactly a surgical weapon. It's more a burn your enemies to the ground kind of weapon, an all or nothing weapon. It's the kind of weapon you hope works best as a deterrent because using it doesn't really leave a lot of useful things behind. Daenerys appears to know this when she responds to the suggestion of just having the dragons burn everything with her not wanting to be the Queen of Ashes. Well, until her best friend is pushed off a wall. Rhaenyra has the same revelation about what a war between two dragon-riding factions could result in, saying she didn't want to be the Queen of Ash and Bone. When you're the second born in a hereditary monarchy, unless you're the fratricide type, you know you're not going to be king or get any of the cool stuff. Unless your brother turns out daughters, then maybe? That was Daemon's hope, but Viserys went with Rhaenyra instead. Part of his drive is that he was meant to be in line on some level, but when Rhaenyra mentions the vision of the Song of Fire and Ice that's passed on from king to heir, she realizes Daemon never heard it. Viserys never intended Daemon as an heir. Ouch. House Celtigar gets another mention after being involved early on during the fighting at the Stepstones, but the Lords of Celtigar supposedly have a secret weapon that would be super cool, a horn that's said to be able to summon a kraken. It doesn't factor in the books, but come on, kraken versus dragon? Hell yeah.